I've demonstrated a lot of different watercolor techniques on this channel. This week I put many of them to use when I painted this Kingfisher. This painting had me drawing on lots of different techniques that I've talked about and demonstrated here on my channel. I used a limited palette of only 3 Winsor & Newton colours: phthalo turquoise, burnt sienna and Winsor orange, and I used a touch of black on the beak and the eye. I worked wet on wet, wet on dry, and dry on wet. I lifted colour out to create highlights. I painted negatively to create feather detail. I glazed colour over the top of another colour to enhance it. I charged one colour into another to create some interesting effects. And I created some deliberate watercolour blooms. I even blew the paint around on the background with a straw. As I said, all of these things, except for the straw blowing, I've talked about and demonstrated here on my channel. So it will be good to see all of them used on this one painting. I did a colour study before I painted the main painting, and that helped me to see exactly what it was going to look like. And it allowed me to begin the main painting with confidence. I want to show all these different techniques coming together now, but before I do, I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning platform with thousands of classes. There's a lot to explore and there are real projects that you can create. You can join classes on illustration, design, painting, drawing, photography, or you can learn some life skills like how to be more productive. Skillshare is curated specifically for learning, which means there are no annoying ads, and they're always launching new premium classes so you can stay focused and follow wherever your creativity takes you. Here's a painting class by Sara Boccaccini Meadows called Botanical Illustration, Paint a Colourful Garden with Watercolour and Gouache. In this class, you'll learn to combine watercolour with gouache to paint a colourful garden scene. Sara is a print designer and illustrator, and she has a lot of industry experience to share. In this class, you'll create loose sketches, you'll mix colours, you'll layer your paints, and you'll add detail with pen and gouache. I love how Sarah takes you to the botanic gardens and demonstrates how she makes simple sketches of some of the plants in her diary. An annual subscription to Skillshare costs less than $10 a month, so it's good value. If you want to take a look and see some of the classes on offer, I've included a link with this video. The first 1,000 people who click the link in my description will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership so they can explore their creativity. Okay, let's have a look at this painting now. I used Arches cold-pressed watercolour paper, 640 GSM in weight. This is thick paper that doesn't need to be stretched, but if you've been watching my videos, you'll know that I do stretch this thick paper because it will bow slightly when you use a lot of water like I do, and I prefer to paint on paper that is completely flat. I mixed a tiny bit of burnt sienna into phthalo turquoise, and I used my 2-inch paddle brush to paint a quick and simple splash on the background. I dipped my brush in the water pot and then I splashed a few splashes of water on it to disturb the pigment. Then I thought I'd blow through a straw to blow some of the pigment across the paper to create a few splashy marks. Then I got another brush and dropped some more water onto it. Dropping the water onto the drying paint creates watercolour blooms, or watercolour cauliflowers, some people call them. That creates interesting shapes on the background and it adds interest to the painting. You'll see me do that again on the branch later in the video. I let the background dry and then I washed in the head and the back with some of the phthalo turquoise. Here on the front, I'm using burnt sienna. My plan is to get a light layer of colour all over the bird. I'll let that dry and then I'll start to deepen the colours and add detail. Here on the wing, I'm starting to paint in the colour that I used on the background. This was phthalo turquoise, but I've mixed a bit of burnt sienna into it. I wet the paper before I put this colour on, and that's given me that soft paintage that runs down here. I painted in the rest of the wing, and then I started on the tail feathers as well. I painted the tail feathers and flight feathers in individually, which saved me some time later on because you could see the individual feathers. I didn't have to do a great deal of work over the top. For the branch, instead of getting a pre-mixed brown out, I decided to use the colours that I had already out on my palette. So that's burnt sienna. I'll mix some phthalo turquoise with it. I've put too much of the phthalo turquoise in it there, so I get a bit more burnt sienna out to warm it back up again. I wet the branch with water before I put the paint on. And then I used that colour that I mixed. I wet the paper so that I could leave some white paper showing without getting hard edges forming everywhere. I wanted a soft, pale wash over the top, which I would build on top of. So here you can see I've got a pale wash of that colour over the top, but I've left a bit of white paper showing. So I haven't completely covered it with paint. While that's wet, I'll use some of the colour that I used on the bird. This is the phthalo turquoise mixed with burnt sienna. I didn't want to introduce a new colour. I wanted to use the colours that I've already been using. Here I'm working wet on wet. So I ran that along the bottom edge while it was wet, and then it bled back over the brown and blended with it. Then I dropped in some burnt sienna as well while it was wet. This is just one of the reasons I love using watercolour. It's effortless. You can get some amazing results very quickly. Here I'm starting to drop some water onto the drying pigment. That disturbs the pigment and creates some watercolour blooms, which will create some texture on the branch. This is how it looks so far. I've got a light wash of colour over the bird, and I've painted in the branch with a light layer of colour. You can see those watercolour blooms on the branch now that they've dried. That's given it some texture and some character, and all I have to do now is paint a few extra lines over it and maybe a shadow where the bird is. Now I want to start painting the markings on top of the head, so I've wet the front section of the head with some water. And for this I'm going to use my dry palette. So I need to mix up a dark colour from the phthalo turquoise and burnt sienna mixed together. And then I'm going to dry the paint on my palette. That has dried now. It's completely dry, so it's ready for me to use. I'll pick up the paint with a damp brush. I want to create some soft edge stripes on the top of the head. I want the paint to stay where I put it. I don't want it to spread too far. So I work on the wet paper with the dry paint, and that gives me exactly what I'm looking for. It stays where I put it, but I still get those soft edges. So all I've done is taken the water out of the paint. There's water on the paper, there's a little bit of water in my brush. There was no water in the paint. I wet a small section of the head at a time. I work on that while it's wet. When it dries, I wet the next section and I keep going with that dry palette. Wetting the next section, and then I keep going. Further back on the head, I don't want stripes. I want more of a circular pattern. On the wet paper, the paint spreads a little bit, but it's not out of control. I can still see that lighter wash showing through, and as it starts to dry, I can come back onto the damp paper and reinforce some of it with a bit more of that dry paint. I've painted in the eye and I've put a wash over the beak. I've also painted some feather detail beside the beak. Now I'm painting some water onto the back. I want to deepen the colour here. This is phthalo turquoise mixed with a touch of burnt sienna. It's darker than my initial wash. The water on the paper keeps those paint edges soft. So I'm gradually darkening areas and adding detail over the top of my lighter wash. I've wet the burnt sienna feathers at the front. Now I've got more burnt sienna and I'm starting to darken them. This wash has got more pigment in it than the first wash. It's quite a bit darker. I add a bit of the turquoise mixed with burnt sienna just on the side there while it's wet to create some little blue feathers in there. And I paint some burnt sienna into these areas as well to darken them. But I leave some of that lighter underwash showing. I don't completely cover it with the darker colour. I might come even darker here beside the eye. Now I'm going to paint some feather detail onto the wing. I don't want too much here, just a little bit to suggest some feathers. I've just wet underneath that first feather, and now I've got the phthalo turquoise and burnt sienna mixture. So I'm negatively painting now. I'm painting around that feather so that I get a little feather shape above the mark that I'm making. And then I absorb some of that paint with my brush. I'll come down here away from that area so I don't disturb it. I've just wet over the top of that feather. When I paint feathers this way, what I'm looking at is the edge of the feather above. I'm painting the area around the feather to create the shape of the feather. So I'm painting negatively. I'm painting underneath my pencil line, and that forms the feather above. When I remove the pencil lines, you'll see what I've done here. That area has dried now, so I've got my eraser, and that removes the pencil lines that weren't covered with paint, so I can see what I'm doing better. To push that area back a bit, to soften any hard, sharp, distracting edges, I can gently paint some clean water over the top. That helps to soften that area that I've just painted. Here I've got some phthalo turquoise mixed with burnt sienna again, and I'm painting that over the top. You'll still see that work that I did, but it won't be quite so obvious. It will make that feather detail area look much softer. Just before it dries, I wrap a tissue around my finger and then I use it to dab off a few highlights. And that makes some feather shapes in the damp paint. Here I'm going to paint negatively as well. I paint in that feather that's there, but I push the paint into the lighter colour above to create that jagged edge, and that creates the bottom of the feathers above. It gives them a jagged edge there. And here I'm painting wet on dry. Here I do it again. I put the paint on the feather below and push that paint up into the lighter colour above to create that jagged edge. I decided to use a bit of the Windsor orange to brighten up the burnt sienna, so I'm glazing that over the top. That gives it a bit more of a glow. I want to add a little bit of detail to the branch, not too much. I want the focus to be on the bird, so I don't want to spend too much time on the branch. I also want to keep the colours down here quite a bit paler than what they are on the reference photo that I'm using. This is the brown that I used on the branch itself when I washed it in, but it's a bit darker here. I'm painting on dry paper. It's to make it look like it's hollow in there. Before that paint dries, I'll drop in some of the phthalo turquoise just to create some interest. I'll use that brown colour along this line here. I've wet this area so that the paint will bleed. Trying to keep all my colours pale, like I said. I want a little bit of detail, but I don't want to overdo it. I'm doing the same thing here. I drew a pencil line for myself to follow. I painted some water underneath it, and now I've got burnt sienna. I'm using the same colours that I've used on the bird. I'm not introducing any new colours. I decided to paint a shadow in underneath the bird. This is the brown that I used on the branch. I'm keeping it fairly pale. While that's wet, I'll drop in some of the phthalo turquoise. To finish off, I used some burnt sienna around the white areas to create a tiny bit more detail. And there it is. I really enjoyed painting this little kingfisher, and it doesn't matter what subject I paint, the techniques that I use remain the same. It's important to practice them over and over so that you can use them whenever you need them. I hope this video was helpful to you. Please give it a like and also subscribe to my channel. And I will be back next week with another video for you. I charged one colour into another to create some interesting effects. Done that before. I charged one colour into another to create some interesting effects. I charged one colour into another to create some interesting effects. I want to show all these different texts to you, all the different texts painting, and that helped me to see exactly what it was going to look like, and it allowed me to begin the main painting with confidence. Main painting. Here's a painting class by Sarah Boccaccini. That's cheese. Boccaccini. Here's a painting class by Sarah Boccaccini. Oh, I did it again. Boccaccini. Here's a painting class by Sarah Boccaccini. Oh, I did it again. As I said, all of these things, except for the blowing of the paint with the straw, I've demonstrated here on my channel. So So, I've included a link with this video. The first 1,000 people who click the link on my subscription. An annual subscription. Why am I looking down at the table?